There's a version of events that keeps circling in whispers, interviews, breakdowns, and counter-breakdowns, and it all starts with a disturbing idea that nothing here was accidental, that every move was placed before the world even knew the game had begun. And once you start following that thread, even the smallest detail begins to feel like a clue someone left behind on purpose, waiting to be noticed too late.
Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's dramatic royal exit was not an escape plan at all, but rather a negotiation that catastrophically backfired.
Some of the questionable behavior leading up to it felt like it was kind of building to something, or like the Sussex had an agenda, a secret agenda going on behind the scenes. Harry and Meghan never actually meant to leave. The whole dramatic exit was a dare, a bet that the Queen would panic and beg them to stay on their terms. She didn't blink. And the real proof isn't in anything they said. It's in everything they quietly built before they said a single word. That's where the tension begins, because if you believe this interpretation, then the exit was an emotional collapse. It was strategy, a controlled pressure test aimed at the very center of the monarchy. Critics of this narrative argue it reads too neatly, too perfectly, as if every action had already been assigned meaning before it even happened. But supporters of this theory point to timing, structure, and preparation that feel almost too aligned to ignore.
This very specific theory that Megxit was a bluff by Harry and Meghan to try to force the half-in, half-out arrangement that they were seeking. And the Queen called it.
They genuinely believed the monarchy needed them more than they needed the monarchy, and that single idea becomes the spine of everything that follows. Because once you accept that belief as the starting point, every decision that came after looks less like retreat and more like negotiation disguised as withdrawal.
The main reason why I think that this was a bluff and a sort of negotiation tactic that spiraled out of Harry and Meghan's control has a lot to do with their initial statement that they made when they announced Megxit. Some of the questionable behavior leading up to it felt like it was kind of building to something, or like the Sussexes had an agenda, a secret agenda going on behind the scenes. And then it was further sort of backed up by the events that followed Megxit and the way Harry and Meghan behaved.
It sounds insane when you put it that plainly, but once you look at the months leading up to that announcement, it stops looking like a couple cracking under pressure and starts looking like something that was planned, staged, and timed. Because to pull off a bluff that size, you need three things locked in before you ever show your hand: your own money, your own PR machine, and your own direct line to the public, so you never have to go through the palace again. And this is where the narrative sharpens into something almost investigative, because those elements didn't just appear out of nowhere according to this interpretation. They were already forming, already aligning, like pieces sliding into place long before the public was even aware a game was being played.
Megxit is all about fulfilling Meghan's desires. That's what it's all about. And so Harry is doing that. He's looking to her because he is looking to her. He's looking to her for this grand plan that they have. And she is looking somewhere off into the future because she is the one guiding this. Even though she's clasping his hand, she's the one guiding and directing them.
And here's what should make your jaw drop. By the time that statement went live, they already had all three. Let me show you exactly when they built them. Go back to 2019. Before there was a single public whisper about leaving, while everyone was cooping over a new baby and a glamorous tour, something very different was happening behind the curtain. First, the trademark. They quietly registered Sussex Royal as a global brand across clothing, books, charity work, hundreds of categories. And suddenly, the story splits in two directions. One version says this is normal modernization, brand protection, routine planning for public figures. The other version says this is the first real fracture, the moment identity stops being purely institutional and starts becoming commercial architecture. The same action, two completely opposite meanings depending on who you believe.
So let's begin by going all the way back to 2019, the end of 2019, from the South Africa "nobody's asked me if I'm okay" thing through to Megxit first. So suspiciously, in late 2019, Harry and Meghan quietly registered Sussex Royal as a trademark globally for hundreds of items, things like clothing, educational materials, campaign initiatives. This shows clear intent to aggressively monetize their titles while remaining working royals, because they did this before there was any talk of them leaving, according to Everybody.
Everybody, that's not what you do when you're committed to a quiet life of public service. That's what you do when you're building a business off your titles and you intend to cash in while still inside the institution. Then came the structural split. They broke away from the Royal Foundation, the shared charity with William and Catherine. On the surface, a boring administrative footnote. In reality, the first wall coming down, separating their operation from the palaces so they could run their own staff their own way. At this point, the atmosphere of the story changes. It's no longer just about disagreement or discomfort inside a family institution. It becomes about control, access, messaging, and who gets to define reality first. Because in this version of events, whoever speaks directly to the public first wins the perception war. And that leads straight into the next phase, where communication channels, press strategies, and digital infrastructure become just as important as titles or traditions. Because once trust between institution and individual starts to crack, everything becomes about narrative dominance, not just public duty.
But to get their half-in, half-out model that they were seeking, you need 3 things, separate from the crown. You need your own foundation, your own PR team, and your own direct line to the media. And Harry and Meghan had systematically set this up before announcing Megxit. In June, way back 6 months before any of this started, Harry and Meghan officially split from the Royal Foundation, which was the joint charity that they shared with Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales.
They hired a Hollywood crisis management PR firm, a celebrity firm, while they were working royals. Royals don't do that. Royals go through the palace press team. Bringing in outside American spin doctors meant one thing. They were building a narrative the palace couldn't see and couldn't control. And from here, the tension escalates even further, because every new development is no longer interpreted as coincidence. It's read as preparation, a system being assembled piece by piece before the moment of separation even arrives. The entire narrative stopped being theory and turned into something the world could react to in real time, because now there was no what if left, only consequences. Every earlier detail, every alleged preparation, every suspicious coincidence suddenly gets dragged back into the spotlight and reinterpreted as either proof of foresight or proof of overreach. And that's where the real fracture in public perception begins, because people are no longer just watching an exit, they're arguing over whether it was a masterstroke or a miscalculation that spiraled out of control. It sat there, finished, waiting, and the moment that bombshell statement dropped, the site went live. Same instant, perfectly synchronized. That synchronization becomes one of the most debated details in this entire saga, because to some it looks like precision, coordination, and planning at a level that suggests a structured rollout. To others, it's simply modern digital strategy, nothing more than standard preparation for a high-profile announcement. But in this version of the story, timing is never neutral. Timing becomes intent. You don't accidentally have a fully built website ready to launch at the exact second of a spontaneous decision. That's not a couple at the end of their rope. That's a product launch. And there was one event months before the announcement where they tipped their hand completely. South Africa, autumn 2019. On paper, a diplomatic tour. And suddenly, the lens shifts again, because now even public appearances are being re-examined like coded messages. A tour becomes a test run. A speech becomes a signal. A moment of emotion becomes interpreted as strategy. And once you enter that frame of thinking, nothing is ever just what it looks like on the surface again. Because now every action before January 2020 gets pulled into one giant pattern, and the pattern being suggested is simple but explosive. That separation wasn't reactive. It was structured, staged, and already operational before anyone outside the inner circle fully understood what was happening. And then comes the turning point where the palace itself responds, not with chaos, not with public drama, but with something colder, more controlled, and far more final. Because institutions like this don't argue in public the way individuals do. They absorb, they contain, and then they decide. The Sandringham meeting becomes that moment of containment, the conversation where possibilities narrow down into hard boundaries. Half in, half out gets removed from the table entirely, not debated endlessly, not negotiated into compromise, but rejected as structurally incompatible. And that rejection becomes the core rupture point of the entire saga, because it removes the middle ground completely. From that point onward, the story is no longer about trying to find balance. It becomes about consequences, about who moves first, who controls narrative space, and who gets to define what the exit actually means in public memory. And what follows is a chain reaction of announcements, adjustments, and legal and reputational recalibrations that solidify separation rather than soften it. Titles, patronages, branding, security all become contested terrain. Each each side interpreting the same decisions in completely opposite ways. One side sees protection of tradition, the other sees restriction and control. Neither interpretation fully cancels the other, and that tension is exactly what keeps the story alive years later. But the most emotionally charged layer of this entire narrative is not strategy or timing, it's perception. Because somewhere in the middle of all this institutional conflict, the public itself becomes a participant, reacting, judging, aligning, and reshaping the story as it unfolds. And once public sentiment enters the equation, nothing remains contained anymore. Every interview, every documentary, every statement released afterward is no longer just communication. It becomes ammunition in an ongoing narrative war where both sides are trying to stabilize their version of truth. And yet, even after everything, the story circles back to the same unresolved question that started it all. Was this a bold attempt to rewrite the rules of an ancient institution, or a misread of how deeply those rules are embedded? Because depending on who you ask, this was either a calculated bluff that met an immovable structure, or an institution that refused to bend until both sides walked away, permanently changed. And even now, years later, the echoes of that decision are still moving, still reshaping reputations, still fueling arguments that never fully settle, because this was never just an exit. It was a test of power, perception, and permanence, and nobody involved seems to agree on who actually passed or failed it.